There are doors in your life that you only recognize as doors long after you have passed through them. They do not announce themselves with ornate frames or heavy hinges. They arrive disguised as ordinary Tuesday nights, as the low hum of a refrigerator, as the sound of a friend's fist knocking softly against cheap apartment wood. For me, that door was Julian. And for the longest time, I stood on the threshold, terrified to move in either direction, convinced that the slightest motion would cause the entire frame to collapse, bringing the world I had so carefully constructed down with it. The first time he knocked, the first time the ritual truly began, it was just after midnight. The city outside my window had finally exhaled its last frenetic breath, leaving behind a silence that was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a siren. I was in my dark room, a converted closet that always smelled of vinegar and silver, watching an image of a rain-slicked street slowly materialize in the chemical bath. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could control the light, where I could coax ghosts from slips of paper. Then came the knock, 3 soft thuds that were too gentle to be a threat, yet too insistent to be ignored. It was a sound that carried the weight of an apology. I knew it was him before I even opened the door. No one else came to my apartment that late, and no one else knocked with such a hesitant blend of desperation and courtesy. When I pulled the door open, the hallway light spilled into my dark living room, throwing my own shadow long and skeletal behind me. Julian stood there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He was the sun, Julian was. A supernova of easy laughter and broad-shouldered confidence that drew people into his orbit without any effort at all. At college, he had been the star swimmer, cleaving through the water with a power that seemed almost violent in its grace, while I was the quiet boy on the sidelines, my eye pressed to a viewfinder, trying to capture the poetry of a world he so effortlessly commanded. But standing in my doorway that night, the light had gone out of him. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was a mess, and his eyes, usually a bright, clear blue, were clouded over with a storm I could not name. He was wearing a faded university sweatshirt and held his keys so tightly in his hand that his knuckles were white. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, and in that look, I saw a profound and terrifying loneliness, a mirror to the one I had long since learned to call my own. He finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "Hey," it was all he said. "Hey." Not, "Sorry it's so late," or "Can I come in?" Just "Hey." A single word that was less a greeting and more a plea. I stepped back, pulling the door wider in a silent invitation. He shuffled inside, his gaze sweeping over the familiar chaos of my small apartment. The stacks of photography books on the floor, the prints pinned to the walls in various stages of development, the single ficus tree drooping in the corner. He had been here 100 times before, for movie nights with our group of friends, for pre-bar gatherings in our university days, for a quick coffee. But this was different. This was not a social call. This was a seeking of refuge. He drifted towards the old, worn sofa that had been my one big furniture purchase after graduation, and sank into it, as if his bones had suddenly turned to liquid. I closed the door, shutting out the sterile light of the hallway, and the room was plunged back into a comfortable gloom, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city filtering through the thin curtains. I did not turn on a lamp. The darkness felt like a necessary blanket, a courtesy to whatever raw thing he was carrying inside him. We met during our sophomore year, in a mandatory literature class we both resented. He was Julian, the engineer and athlete, who saw the world in clean lines of code and the precise physics of a perfect flip turn. I was Leo, the arts student, who saw the world as frames of light and shadow, as compositions waiting to be captured. We were an unlikely pairing. He sat in the front, always engaged, asking questions that were pragmatic and direct. I sat in the back, sketching in a notebook, only speaking when called upon. Our friendship began not with a spark, but with a slow, quiet burn. It started with him asking to borrow my notes, his own being a series of illegible scribbles and diagrams of fluid dynamics. It grew over late-night study sessions in the library, where I would try to explain the symbolism in Faulkner and he would try to explain the beauty of a well-structured algorithm. He was fascinated by the way I saw things. He would pick up one of my prints, a stark black and white shot of a gnarled tree or a child's lost shoe in a puddle, and trace the lines with his finger. "How do you do that?" he would ask, genuinely mystified. "How do you see this, when everyone else just sees a tree?" And I, in turn, was mesmerized by the certainty with which he moved through the world. He had a plan, a trajectory. He was building things, tangible things that worked, while I was just trying to capture feelings, intangible things that often broke. Our friendship solidified into something deep and essential. He became my anchor to the more practical, sunlit world, and I think, became his quiet harbor, a place where he did not have to perform. He was dating Amelia then, a bright, bubbly girl from the business school who was as ambitious and outgoing as he was. They were the perfect couple, the kind you saw in university brochures. They laughed at the same jokes, finished each other's sentences, and shared a vision of a future that seemed pre-written and guaranteed. I liked Amelia. She was kind and smart, and she clearly adored Julian. And I was happy for him, truly. But there was a small, guarded room deep inside me where a different feeling lived. A quiet, persistent ache that would flare up whenever I saw him laugh with her, or when he would sling his arm around her shoulders. It was a feeling I never gave a name to. It was my secret, a negative I kept undeveloped in a dark, locked box, because to expose it to the light would be to destroy it, and to destroy the most important friendship I had ever known. So I became the perfect friend, the supportive, ever-present, completely platonic observer of his life. I was the one he called when he had a fight with Amelia, the one who listened patiently as he worked through his anxieties about internships and career paths. I was his constant, his safe space. And I was so good at playing that role that I think, for a while, I even managed to convince myself. The breakup, when it came, was not a sudden explosion but a slow, grinding collapse. It happened a year after we graduated, after they had moved in together, after the rings had been discussed, and the future had seemed all but set in stone. It was a death by 1,000 small cuts. Their ambitions, once aligned, began to diverge. The pressures of his demanding job as a software consultant and her grueling hours at a finance firm left them with little time for each other. The easy laughter was replaced by tired arguments over trivial things. Julian, who had always been so direct, became withdrawn. He stopped talking about it, but I could see the strain in the tight set of his jaw, in the way he would stare into the middle distance when he thought no one was looking. He called me one night, his voice hollow. "It's over, Leo," he said. And that was it. He did not offer details, and I did not ask for them. The foundation of his world had cracked, and he was standing in the rubble. That was 3 weeks before he showed up at my door just after midnight. In those 3 weeks, he had tried to soldier on. He threw himself into his work, went to the gym with a manic intensity, met up with friends for loud, boisterous nights out that were transparently hollow. He was performing stability, building a facade of okayness that was so fragile I was afraid to breathe too hard around it. We talked on the phone, had coffee a couple of times. He spoke about everything and nothing, work, sports, a new video game. But he never spoke about her, about the gaping hole she had left in his life, in his apartment, in his bed. He was adrift on a vast, silent ocean, and he was pretending he knew how to swim. But the nights, I suspected, were the hardest part. The nights were when the silence became too loud, when the emptiness of the other side of the bed became a physical presence. And so he came to me, back in my living room. He had not moved from the sofa. He was just sitting there, staring at his hands, which were now resting loosely in his lap. I moved quietly to the kitchen, my bare feet making no sound on the old wooden floors. I filled a glass with water and brought it to him. He took it without looking up, his fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a tiny jolt that shot up my arm. It was a completely insignificant touch, the kind of incidental contact that happens between friends 1,000 times a day, but in the charged silence of that room, it felt momentous. My entire body was a finely tuned instrument, hyper-aware of his proximity, of the space between us, of the scent of his laundry detergent and the faint, clean smell of his skin. It was exhausting, this constant, secret vigilance. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly, sitting in the armchair across from him. It felt safer to have a piece of furniture, a small mote of empty space, between us. He shook his head, still staring at his hands. He took a small sip of water. "No," he said. His voice was thick. I couldn't be there. In the apartment. It's too quiet. It's too full of her." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were glistening. "Is it okay if I just sit here for a while?" "Of course," I said, my own voice softer than I intended. "Stay as long as you need." And so the ritual began. It was not a conscious decision, not a plan we made. It simply happened. A few nights later, he was there again. This time, he brought a pizza, as if to create a pretext to frame his need for company as a casual hangout. We ate in comfortable silence, watching some mindless action movie on my small television. He was more present this time, making a few jokes, commenting on the ridiculous plot. But as the movie ended and the credits rolled, the silence rushed back in to fill the space, and the tension returned to his shoulders. He did not make a move to leave. He just sat there, his leg pressed lightly against mine on the cramped sofa. I could feel the warmth of him through my jeans. I focused on my breathing, in and out, trying to appear relaxed, casual, as if I did not feel like every nerve ending in my body was on fire. Eventually, his head began to nod. His breathing deepened. His head lolled to the side and came to rest, gently, on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. It was the most intimate physical contact we had ever shared, and it was happening under the guise of sleep, of accident. A part of my brain, the logical, self-protective part, screamed at me to move, to shift away, to gently wake him and send him home. It was a dangerous boundary to cross. But the other part of me, the part that had been secretly yearning for this for years, was overwhelmed by a wave of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. His hair was soft against my cheek. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He felt so heavy, so solid, so real. He was trusting me with his unconsciousness, with his vulnerability. It was a gift, and I could not bring myself to refuse it. So I sat there, perfectly still, for over an hour, my own neck cramping, my arm falling asleep, until the city outside began to show the first pale, gray signs of dawn. I felt like a guardian, a watchman. I was protecting his sleep. And in that moment, I would have done anything to keep him safe. When he finally stirred, he pulled back abruptly, blinking in confusion, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Oh, man," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Sorry, I must have. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "You were exhausted." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. Annoyance, judgment, pity. I tried to keep my expression neutral, friendly. I tried to offer him the plausible deniability he so clearly needed. It was just a friend falling asleep on another friend's shoulder. It meant nothing. But we both knew, in the unspoken language that had developed between us over years of friendship, that it meant everything. It was a crack in the platonic wall we had so carefully maintained. And through that crack, something new and terrifying and beautiful was beginning to seep. He left quickly after that, with a mumbled thanks, and I was left alone in my apartment, the indentation of his head still warm on my shoulder, my heart pounding a frantic, hopeful, terrified rhythm against my ribs. The next time, a week or so later, he did not even pretend. He just showed up, looking wrecked. "Long day," he grunted, and collapsed onto the sofa. We did not talk much. I made him tea, and we sat in the semi-darkness, listening to the city. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with 1,000 unasked questions, with a tension that was both deeply comforting and excruciatingly painful. I knew what he needed. He did not need words of wisdom or hollow reassurances. He needed presence. He needed to not be alone. That night, when he inevitably fell asleep, I was more prepared. I gently maneuvered him so he was lying down, his head on a cushion. I found an old quilt in my closet and draped it over him. I watched him sleep for a long time, his face relaxed and boyish in the dim light. The sharp, handsome lines of his waking face softened, revealing a vulnerability that he kept so well hidden during the day. I wanted to photograph him like that. I wanted to capture the sheer, unguarded beauty of him. But I did not. It felt like a violation, like stealing a piece of him that he had not explicitly offered. So I just watched, committing the image to memory, a private collection of moments that were mine and mine alone. This pattern continued for weeks, then months. My apartment became his unofficial sanctuary. He never called ahead. He would just appear, sometimes early in the evening, sometimes long after midnight. He kept a toothbrush in my bathroom, a spare t-shirt in my drawer. Our friends started to notice. "Julian's practically living at your place," one of them remarked casually one afternoon. I just shrugged, forcing a nonchalant smile. "His place is a ghost town right now. He just needs a change of scenery." It was a flimsy excuse, but no one pressed the issue. They saw it as me being a good friend to someone going through a tough time. And I was. I was being the best friend I could possibly be. But I was also living a lie, a double life. Outwardly, I was the supportive friend. Inwardly, I was a man walking a tightrope over a canyon of longing, every step a calculated risk. Every night he spent on my sofa was a strange form of torture. I would lie awake in my own bed, just one thin wall away from him, and listen to the sound of his breathing. I would imagine the shape of him under the quilt, the way his hair fell across his forehead. I was so close, yet he was a million miles away. The loneliness was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest that was made all the more acute by his presence. The shift from the sofa to my bed was so gradual I almost did not see it coming. It started one particularly cold night in late autumn. He had arrived shivering, soaked through from an unexpected downpour. I gave him dry clothes, and he huddled on the sofa, wrapped in every blanket I owned. But he could not seem to get warm. I watched him, his teeth chattering slightly, and a thought, bold and reckless, surfaced in my mind. "You'll freeze out here," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "The sofa is drafty. Just take my bed. I can sleep out here." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "No, man, I can't kick you out of your own bed. That's insane." "It's not insane," I insisted, my heart hammering. "It's practical. I have more blankets. I'll be fine. You need to actually sleep." We argued back and forth for a few minutes, a polite dance of refusal and insistence. But he was tired, and I was stubborn. Eventually, he relented. I watched him disappear into my bedroom, and I felt a tremor of something I could not identify. It was part victory, part terror. I had moved him closer. I had brought him into the most intimate space in my home. I spent that night on the sofa, listening to the unfamiliar silence from my own room. I did not sleep at all. I was too aware of him, of his presence in my bed, under my sheets, his head on my pillow. The air itself seemed to have changed, to be charged with his energy. It was intoxicating and agonizing. He took my bed a few more times after that, always with the same ritual of polite protest and my firm, logical insistence. It became our new normal, but it was an unsustainable arrangement. I was perpetually exhausted from sleepless nights on the lumpy sofa, and the charade was wearing thin. The breaking point came one night when I was battling a nasty head cold. I was feverish and miserable, and the thought of sleeping on the sofa felt like a cruel and unusual punishment. He arrived late. As usual, his face etched with the familiar exhaustion of a long week. He took one look at me, huddled under a blanket and shivering, and his expression shifted from tired to concerned. "You look terrible," he said, his voice laced with genuine worry. He came over and pressed the back of his hand to my forehead. His touch was cool and gentle, and I leaned into it instinctively before I could stop myself. The concern in his eyes was so real, so unguarded, that it made my throat tighten. "I'm fine," I croaked, which was an obvious lie. "No, you're not. You're sick. You should be in bed," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And where are you going to sleep?" I countered, trying to sound firm, but my voice was weak. He was quiet for a moment, looking from me to the closed bedroom door, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He seemed to be working through some complex internal calculation. Then he looked back at me, his gaze direct. "The bed's big enough for two," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "If you're okay with it, we can just sleep. It's stupid for one of us to be on this couch, especially you when you're sick." My mind went completely blank. The air left my lungs. It was such a simple, logical suggestion. Two friends sharing a bed to solve a practical problem. It happened all the time. It was not a big deal. But for me, it was a seismic event. It was the crossing of a Rubicon I never thought we would approach. I searched his face for any sign of a hidden meaning, any hint of subtext. But there was nothing. Just pragmatism and concern. He was offering a solution, not a proposition. And yet, the room was suddenly charged with an electric current. The space between us hummed with unspoken possibilities. "Leo," he prompted gently, seeing my hesitation. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. To say no would be to admit that it was a big deal, that it meant something more to me. To say no would be to reveal the secret I had guarded for so long. To say yes was to walk willingly into the heart of the fire, to subject myself to a new and exquisite form of torture. I chose the fire. "Okay," I whispered. That first night was surreal. We got into bed from opposite sides, a careful, choreographed dance of not touching. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, a gulf of several inches of mattress between us. The silence was deafening. I was acutely aware of every tiny sound. The rustle of the sheets as he shifted his weight, the soft sigh of his breath, the frantic, silent screaming of my own pulse in my ears. I lay perfectly still, my muscles rigid, convinced that if I moved even a millimeter, I would accidentally brush against him and the whole fragile illusion of platonic cohabitation would shatter. I felt his heat radiating across the space between us, a magnetic pull that I had to actively resist. I was a cartographer of the space in my own bed, mapping the terrain of his presence, the borders of his body, the treacherous, unclaimed territory in the middle. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. "You okay?" "Yeah." I lied, my voice tight. "You?" "Yeah," he answered, just as quietly. "Good night, Leo. Good night, Julian." And then there was only the sound of our breathing. I did not sleep. I do not think he did either, not for a long time. I listened as his breathing eventually deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to relax, just a little. I turned my head on the pillow, ever so slightly, and looked at him. The moonlight filtering through the window cast a silvery glow on his face. I could see the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, the gentle curve of his lips. He was so beautiful it hurt. A deep, aching tenderness washed over me, so powerful it felt like grief. I loved him. It was a fact as solid and inescapable as the floor beneath my bed. I had never allowed myself to form the words, not even in the privacy of my own mind. But there they were, stark and undeniable in the quiet intimacy of that room. I loved him, and he was sleeping in my bed, completely unaware. The irony was so profound, so cruel, that I almost laughed. Instead, I just lay there, watching him, until the first light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The bed sharing became the new ritual. The pretense of me being sick was quickly forgotten. It simply became the thing we did. He would come over, we would watch a movie or just sit in comfortable silence, and then we would go to bed. The initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a practiced, careful intimacy. We developed an unspoken choreography. He always took the side closest to the wall. I always took the side closest to the door. We maintained a sliver of space between us, a respectful, invisible boundary. But as the weeks went on, that boundary began to blur. A cold night would find us huddled closer together for warmth. A restless dream would cause an arm or a leg to cross the divide. One morning, I woke up to find his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. I lay perfectly still, my heart threatening to beat its way out of my chest, soaking in the feeling of his weight against me, the solid reality of him. He woke a few minutes later and pulled back without a word, a faint flush on his cheeks, but he did not apologize. Not anymore. The accidental touches became less accidental, and the apologies ceased altogether. We were living in a liminal space, a strange twilight world that was no longer friendship, but not yet something more. We were two people sharing a life in all the ways that mattered, sharing meals, sharing silences, sharing a bed, but without any of the language to define it. The lack of definition was both a comfort and a torment. It allowed this strange, beautiful intimacy to exist without the pressure of labels, without the risk of a conversation that could shatter it all. It gave him plausible deniability. He was just a guy crashing with his best friend while he got his head straight. But for me, it was a constant state of high alert. I was decoding every gesture, every touch, every lingering look. When he would fall asleep with his head on my chest, was it a simple, unconscious search for comfort, or was it something more? When he would absent-mindedly run his thumb over the back of my hand while we were watching TV, was it a meaningless fidget, or was it a tentative question? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was not even sure a crime had been committed. The ambiguity was killing me, but the thought of losing what we had was even more terrifying. So I stayed silent. I became an expert in the language of the unspoken, a connoisseur of the space between things. My photography changed. Before Julian started staying with me, my work had been stark, lonely. I photographed empty streets, abandoned buildings, solitary figures dwarfed by their surroundings. My pictures were about the beauty of isolation. But now, I found myself drawn to moments of quiet connection. I started a new project, a series of diptychs. On one side, an image of an empty space, an unmade bed, 2 coffee mugs on a table, a dent in a sofa cushion. On the other side, a close-up, almost abstract shot of something intimate, the texture of a quilt, the way light fell across a pillowcase, the intertwined laces of 2 pairs of sneakers by the door. The project was about presence and absence, about the ghosts we leave behind in the spaces we inhabit. It was about him. It was the only way I could speak the truth without using words. He would look at the prints drying in my darkroom and nod, his expression thoughtful. "I like these," he said once, pointing to a shot of the rumpled sheets on his side of the bed. "It feels peaceful, but also a little sad." He had no idea he was looking at a portrait of himself, a portrait of us. The breaking point came, as it always does, on an ordinary night. There was no catalyst, no external drama, just the slow, inexorable buildup of unspoken feelings reaching a critical mass. He had been quiet all evening, a deeper, more melancholic silence than usual. He seemed troubled, his mind 1,000 miles away. We went to bed, assuming our usual positions on our respective sides of the mattress. But the space between us felt different tonight. It felt wider, colder. The silence was not comfortable, it was strained. I lay there, my back to him, my entire body humming with a nervous energy. I could feel him awake behind me. I could sense his restlessness. After what seemed like hours, he shifted, the mattress dipping with his weight. I felt his hand, hesitant and warm, on my shoulder. "Leo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I did not turn around. I could not. I just lay there, my heart pounding. "Yeah." There was a long pause. I could hear him take a shaky breath. "I can't do this anymore." Ice flooded my veins. This was it. The end. He had realized what was happening, how blurred the lines had become, and he was putting a stop to it. He was going to say he needed to go back to his own apartment, that this arrangement was weird, that he was sorry if he gave me the wrong impression. I braced myself for the impact, for the shattering of this fragile world I had allowed myself to inhabit. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the blow. But the words that came next were not the ones I expected. "I can't keep pretending," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I could not decipher. "Pretending that this is just nothing, that you are just my friend." I still did not move. I could not process what he was saying. My mind was scrambling, trying to fit his words into the narrative I had constructed, the one where I was the only one with feelings, the one where he was the unknowing object of my affection. His words did not fit. He must have taken my silence for rejection, because his hand started to withdraw. But then, as if making a final, desperate choice, His fingers tightened on my shoulder. He moved closer, so close that I could feel the heat of his body all along my back. His lips were close to my ear, his breath a warm puff of air that sent a shiver down my spine. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sound of the city outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the beating of my own heart, it all faded away. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us. It was a question so laden with terror and hope and vulnerability that it felt like a physical weight. He was giving me the choice. He was laying his own fragile, confusing feelings at my feet and trusting me not to crush them. He was giving me all the power, and in doing so, he was revealing a depth of his own fear and longing that I had never imagined. All those nights, I had thought I was the only one walking the tightrope, but he had been up there with me the whole time, walking from the other side, just as terrified of falling. I turned around slowly, my movements feeling sluggish, deliberate, as if I were moving through water. I turned to face him. In the dim moonlight, I could see that his eyes were shining with unshed tears. The bravado, the easy confidence, the sunlit certainty, it was all gone. In its place was just Julian, raw and open and scared. And in that moment, I had never loved him more. I did not answer his question with words. I answered by closing the small distance between us. My hand came up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his cheek. He leaned into my touch, a small, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. And then I kissed him. It was not a passionate kiss, not the kind you see in movies. It was hesitant, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. It was soft and achingly gentle. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and relief. It was a confession, a surrender, a promise. It was the moment the door I had been standing in front of for so long finally swung open, revealing a room I had only ever dreamed of entering. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, our foreheads pressed together, our breathing slowly syncing up. The tension that had been a constant companion for months finally drained away, leaving behind a profound and quiet peace. We had crossed the line, and on the other side, we had found not destruction, but each other. The morning after was terrifying. I woke up first, just as the sun was beginning to rise. Julian was still asleep, his arm thrown possessively over my chest, his head tucked into the curve of my neck. He looked peaceful, younger, but I was wide awake, my mind racing. What now? What did this mean? Last night had been a moment of pure, unadulterated emotional honesty, born of darkness and desperation. But what would happen in the harsh, revealing light of day? I was terrified that he would wake up and regret it, that he would pull away, chalk it up to a moment of confusion and grief, and our fragile new reality would crumble into dust, taking our friendship with it. The fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I carefully extricated myself from his arms, my movements slow and cautious, as if trying not to wake a sleeping dragon. He mumbled in his sleep and reached for me, his hand patting the empty space where I had been. The gesture, so unconscious and instinctive, sent a pang of longing through me. I went into the kitchen and started making coffee, the familiar ritual a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I needed to do something normal, something routine. I measured the grounds, filled the kettle, and stood staring out the window at the waking city, my hands wrapped around a cold mug. I was replaying the kiss, the conversation, every tiny detail, searching for flaws, for signs that I had misinterpreted everything. Had I pushed him? Had he just been lonely and confused, and I had taken advantage of that vulnerability? My mind was my own worst enemy, spinning out 1,000 different catastrophic scenarios. I heard the floorboards creak behind me, and I tensed, my back still to the room. I heard him pad into the kitchen. I did not turn around. I could not bear to see the regret in his eyes. He was silent for a long moment. I could feel his presence behind me, a heavy weight in the small space. Then, he spoke, his voice low and cautious. "Morning, morning," I replied, my voice tight. I kept my eyes fixed on a pigeon strutting along a ledge across the street. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. This was it. The retraction. The apology. I braced myself. "Leo," he said, and there was a strange, strained quality to his voice. "Look at me." I took a deep breath and slowly turned to face him. He was standing by the counter, leaning against it, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing the spare t-shirt he kept at my place, his hair a mess from sleep. He looked exhausted. And more than that, he looked scared. His face was pale, and he was chewing on his lower lip, a nervous habit I had not seen since we had final exams in college. The sight of his fear, so raw and exposed, extinguished my own. This was not just about me. He was just as lost in this as I was. "Last night," he started, then trailed off, unable to find the words. He ran a hand through his hair, looking down at the floor. "I don't know what. I'm so confused," and there it was. The word I had been dreading. Confused. It was a classic escape hatch, a way to invalidate everything that had happened. A wave of cold disappointment washed over me, so intense it felt like a physical blow. I had been a fool. A hopeful, romantic fool. I had built a fantasy out of his loneliness. My voice, when I finally spoke, was flat, devoid of emotion. I was shutting down, retreating back behind the walls I had so carefully constructed. "It's okay, Julian," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You were going through a lot. It was a weird night. We can just forget it." I expected him to look relieved. I expected him to jump at the easy out I was offering him. But instead, his head snapped up, and his eyes, when they met mine, were filled not with relief, but with a flash of hurt, of anger. "Forget it," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think I want to forget it? Is that what you think it was? Something to be forgotten?" I was taken aback by his intensity. I don't know what to think," I stammered honestly. "You said you were confused." "I am confused," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in a gesture of pure frustration. "Of course I'm confused. My whole life, I've had this map. You go to school, you get a good job, you meet a girl, you get married. That's the map. That's the one I've been following. And it led me right off a cliff. And for the past few months, the only thing that has felt real, the only thing that has felt right, is being here. With you." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "But that's not on the map, Leo. You're not on the map. So yeah, I'm confused. And I'm scared. I'm terrified. Because last night was the most honest I've felt in years. And I have no idea what that means." He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his confession hanging in the air between us. He had not taken back the kiss. He had validated it, claimed it, and in the same breath, told me he had no idea what to do with it. The hope I had so brutally suppressed flared back to life, fragile but persistent. This was not a rejection. This was a crisis. He was not pushing me away. He was showing me the chaos inside him. For the next few days, we lived in a state of suspended animation. The physical intimacy vanished. He started sleeping on the sofa again, a deliberate, painful retreat. The easy camaraderie was replaced by a stilted, excruciating politeness. We moved around each other like strangers, careful not to brush against each other, our conversations limited to logistical necessities. "Do you need anything from the store? I'll be working late tonight." The silence in the apartment was no longer comforting. It was a weapon, a thick, suffocating blanket of everything that was being left unsaid. It was 1,000 times worse than before the kiss. Before, there had been hope simmering beneath the surface of ambiguity. Now, there was only the stark reality of a truth that had been spoken and then immediately locked away. He was running scared, and in his fear, he was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick. I tried to be patient. I tried to give him space. I told myself he just needed time to process, to reconcile this new, unexpected part of himself with the man he had always believed he was. But my patience was wearing thin. I felt like I was being punished for his feelings. I had been the safe harbor, and now I was the source of the storm. The pain of it was a constant, dull ache. Seeing him on the sofa, deliberately choosing discomfort and distance over the warmth and intimacy we had shared, was a fresh wound every single night. I felt myself growing resentful, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to shake him, to shout at him, to tell him that his fear was destroying the best thing he had. the best thing we had. But I knew that anger would only push him further away. The confrontation came, not with a bang, but with a quiet, desperate plea. It was a Sunday afternoon. He was supposed to be at my place, but he had sent a terse text an hour earlier. Something came up. Can't make it. It was the third time he had canceled on me in a week. I knew he was avoiding me. I knew he was probably sitting alone in his cavernous, empty apartment, drowning in his own confusion. And I could not take it anymore. I could not sit by and watch him self-destruct and watch us crumble in the process. I grabbed my keys and my camera bag. A nervous habit. Having my camera with me was like carrying a shield, and I walked to his apartment. He lived in one of those new, soulless condo buildings, all glass and steel, with a lobby that felt like a hotel. It was a world away from the lived-in, slightly battered charm of my own neighborhood. When I knocked on his door, it took him a long time to answer. When he finally opened it, he looked surprised, and not pleasantly so. He was still in his sweatpants, his hair uncombed. The apartment behind him was dark, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "You canceled," I said simply. "I was worried." "I'm fine," he said, but he did not meet my eyes. He made no move to invite me in. He was blocking the doorway, a physical barrier between his world and mine. "No, you're not," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "And I'm not fine either. We can't keep doing this, Julian. This silence. It's killing me," he flinched, as if my words had physically struck him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, cornered despair. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to be honest," I said, my voice breaking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "With me, and with yourself. Whatever it is, I can take it. If you regret it, if you think it was a mistake, just tell me. It will hurt, but it will be better than this ghost life we're living. But if you don't, if what you said that morning is true, that it felt honest, then you have to stop running. You have to stop punishing both of us because you're scared." Tears welled in his eyes, and he swiped at them angrily. "You don't get it," he choked out. "It's not that simple. I look in the mirror, and I don't even know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it's all gone. And it's terrifying. I know it's terrifying," I said, taking a step closer. "But you know what's more terrifying? Being alone. And you don't have to be. You think you're the only one who's scared? I've been in love with you for years, Julian. Years. And I've been terrified every single day that I would lose you if you ever found out. I built my whole life around hiding it. And then you kissed me. And for one night, I wasn't scared anymore. Don't make me be scared again." My confession hung in the air between us. I had finally said it. The words I had kept locked away for so long. I had laid all my cards on the table. There was nothing left to hide. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the tears now streaming freely down his face. He looked utterly broken and utterly beautiful. He reached out, his hand shaking, and grabbed the front of my shirt, and he pulled me into the apartment, kicking the door shut behind us. He did not let go of my shirt. He just held on, burying his face in my shoulder, and he sobbed. Great, gut-wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of pent-up emotion and confusion and fear finally being released. I wrapped my arms around him and held him tightly, my own tears starting to fall. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. I just held him, anchoring him as the storm he had been holding inside finally broke. We stood there in the dark hallway of his apartment for a long time, just holding on to each other, two scared, broken people finding their way back to a truth that was simpler and more profound than any map could ever show. That afternoon marked the beginning of the end of the fear. It did not vanish overnight, of course. Fear is a stubborn ghost. It lingers in the corners of rooms and whispers doubts in the quiet hours of the night. But we had brought it out into the light, and in the light, it began to lose its power. We talked for hours that day, sitting on his sofa in the darkened apartment. He told me about the pressure he had always felt to be a certain kind of man, the expectations he had internalized from his family, from society, from himself. He talked about his relationship with Amelia, about the genuine love that had been there, but also about the sense of performing a role, of checking boxes on a pre-approved list. He admitted that his loneliness after the breakup was not just about missing her, but about the terrifying realization that the future he had been building toward was one he was not even sure he wanted. And he talked about me. He talked about how our friendship had always been the most stable, most honest thing in his life. He said that coming to my apartment was like coming home, a place where he could finally take off the armor. He confessed that the feelings he had for me had been there for a long time, a quiet undercurrent he had deliberately ignored because he did not have a name for them, and they did not fit into his life plan. The kiss had not created the feelings. It had simply forced him to acknowledge them. And I talked too. I told him about the years of quiet longing, about the pain of watching him with someone else, about the joy and terror of our shared nights. I told him how I had resigned myself to being his friend and nothing more, because the thought of losing him entirely was unbearable. We laid our secrets bare, our vulnerabilities, our fears. We unburdened ourselves. It was a messy, tear-filled, difficult conversation, but it was honest, and it was the beginning of our real foundation. By the time the sun had set, casting long shadows across the room, the space between us was no longer filled with tension and unspoken words. It was filled with a quiet, fragile understanding. He was still scared. I was still cautious. But we were facing the fear together. That night, I did not go back to my apartment. We ordered food, ate it out of cartons sitting on the floor, and for the first time in weeks, we talked easily, the way we used to. We did not touch, not yet. It was as if we were relearning how to be in the same room, establishing a new set of boundaries built on honesty instead of ambiguity. When it got late, he looked at me, a question in his eyes. "Stay," he said. It was not a plea born of desperation, but a simple, clear request. I nodded. We went into his bedroom, a room I had never been in before. It was neat, minimalist, and impersonal, except for a single framed photograph on his bedside table. It was one of mine, a shot I had taken of a misty lake at dawn years ago. I had given it to him as a birthday gift. The fact that it was the only personal object he kept by his bed made my throat tighten. We got into his bed, the bed that for so long had been a symbol of his past and his loneliness. It was strange at first, unfamiliar territory. But when he reached for my hand in the darkness, his fingers lacing through mine, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He did not pull me closer, did not try to kiss me. He just held my hand, his thumb stroking my knuckles. It was a quiet promise, a declaration. We are in this together. And for the first time in his apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of his old life, we both slept soundly, anchored by the simple, solid fact of each other's presence. The days that followed were a process of gentle rediscovery. We were not just friends anymore, but we were not suddenly boyfriends in the conventional sense. We did not put a label on it. We just were. We were Julian and Leo. We spent our time building a new normal, one quiet moment at a time. It was in the small things. It was him starting to leave the blinds open in his apartment, letting the light in. It was me leaving some of my books on his coffee table, claiming a small piece of his space as my own. It was in the way he started to cook for us, filling his sterile kitchen with the smells of garlic and basil. It was in the way I started to bring my camera to his place, not as a shield, but as a tool to document our new beginning. I took a photograph of him one morning, standing by the window in a sliver of sunlight, a real, unguarded smile on his face. When I developed the print, I knew it was the most honest picture I had ever taken. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was not born of ambiguity or accident. It was intentional. A kiss goodnight was no longer a seismic event, but a quiet affirmation. Cuddling on the sofa while watching a movie was not a source of anxiety, but a source of simple, profound comfort. We learned each other's rhythms, the language of each other's bodies. We learned that I liked to have my back rubbed when I was stressed, and that he always got cold feet and would tuck them under my legs to get warm. We were creating our own private language, a lexicon of gentle touch and quiet understanding. The door to my apartment, the one that had been the stage for the beginning of our story, was no longer the focal point. We moved between our two homes, weaving our lives together, thread by thread. Sometimes we stayed at his place, sometimes at mine. The location did not matter anymore. Home was not a place. It was the person you were with. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, but you look back on them and realize they were the hinges on which your entire world turned. For me, that moment will always be the sound of Julian's soft knock on my apartment door after midnight. It was the sound of a person who was lost, searching for a lighthouse in a storm. And I, who had always thought of myself as a quiet observer hiding in the shadows, discovered that I could be a harbor. I could be a light. We saved each other, I think. He was drowning in a life that was not his own, and I was starving for a connection I was too afraid to ask for. He knocked on my door seeking refuge, and in opening it, I found my own. We did not follow a map to get to where we are. We threw the map away and navigated by the light of a fragile, terrifying, and ultimately unshakable truth. We found our own way, and we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.